that intelligence is a set of technologies developing at astonishing pace, and then it's very difficult to say at one point in time there is this one piece of regulation and that's it. We do need artificial intelligence that serves humanity, that serves the people. And it's our task as elected legislators to make sure that that happens. The council came up with its position, which is called the general approach, earlier than Parliament. And something happened in the meantime before Parliament approved its position, and that was called ChatGPT. And that was the moment, like a week or two after ChatGPT was rolled out in Europe and everybody was using it, when the majority in the European Parliament completely changed.
Hi, I'm Craig Smith, and this is Eye on AI. This week, I talked to Alexandra Geese, a member of the European Parliament. She's worked on the Digital Services Act in the EU and is now one of the members drafting the AI Act. Parliament has just passed an initial draft of the Act, and it's now under negotiation with the European Council and the European Commission. This is the first significant, comprehensive attempt to legislate AI, and everyone in the world is watching what the EU is doing. Certainly, the United States is expected to follow a lot of what the Europeans come up with. And OpenAI, Microsoft, Amazon, all the big AI players, Alphabet, of course, have been lobbying the EU to try and influence the act, try and soften the act. So I wanted to hear from Alexandra how the process has gone. And I think anyone interested in AI legislation will want to hear what she has to say. Before we begin, I want to give a shout out to another podcast. This one's by TechCrunch. It's called Found. Each week, TechCrunch Plus reporters Becca Skutak and Dom Midori Davis talk with a founder about what it's really like to build and run a company from ideation to launch. I'm interested and listen to the podcast because I have my own project. They talk to founders across many industries, and their conversations often lead back to AI, as many startups start to implement AI in what they do. New episodes of Found are published every Tuesday, and you can find them wherever you listen to podcasts. So I encourage you to do so. Now, here's Alexandra.
I'm a member of the European Parliament. I'm from Germany, and I'm with the Greens EFA group. So that's the Green group in Parliament, and I'm a member of the Green Party in Germany, which is currently in government as well. And I've been working on digital politics since I started in 2019. I was what we call a shadow rapporteur, so the person who, for my political group, worked on the Digital Services Act, which is a major piece of legislation for digital platforms. And I have always been interested in artificial intelligence, and they have been following the AI Act very closely.
Okay, so the AI Act has the first draft has been passed by the Parliament. Now it's in a three-party sort of negotiation. Is that right? To nail down a final version. Uh, I guess before we begin, can you give the headlines, the sort of top line explanation of the Act's various clauses or the main points of the Act? I mean, I know what they are, but for listeners that haven't been following it.
Well, yes, it's the Act is trying to be a very dynamic piece of legislation because we are quite aware of the fact that artificial intelligence is a set of technologies developing at astonishing pace, and then it's very difficult to say at one point in time there is this one piece of regulation and that's it. So what we're trying to do is to introduce different categories and to look at applications of artificial intelligence rather than at the technology itself. And the categories are basically banned applications which are banned, which is, for example, social scoring in Chinese style. That's one of the most important bans. Another ban is the one on remote biometric identifications in the public sphere, therefore cameras in the public sphere that in real time can tell the authorities where you are, where you have been, what you have been doing. This is something we know very well from the Hong Kong protests, where people could only protest completely masked and looked very fearfully at these huge cameras installed everywhere. And this is a situation we would like to avoid in Europe. So those are examples. The parliament introduced further bans, for example, on applications that claim to be able to recognize your sexual orientation, just to give an example. Then there's a second category, which is called high risk, which are a long series of combinations of applications in different fields like recruiting, for example, border management, education, where applications need to go through an authorization or licensing procedure. So companies producing them have to decide whether their tool, their AI tool, fits into that category, and then go through this procedure and need to get an authorization by a national authority in one of the member states of the European Union. They also have to have documentation for what they have been doing, what kind of data they have been using for the modeling, so on. And they need to make sure that at every time of the process, there can be a human person, a human in charge. And then there is basically the biggest category, which is low risk, which just has just a few documentation obligations, but doesn't need to be authorized, but can be marketed right away. The parliament introduced the fourth category, which are foundation models. So basically large generative models, which has become famous with ChatGPT. And therefore, we foresee a few obligations also for producers of these large foundation models.
Yeah, actually, can we talk about that? Because that's what initially spurred my desire to talk to you, were comments later retracted by Sam Altman saying that OpenAI may have to withdraw from Europe. I mean, he later said that they were not going to withdraw. But can you talk about that fourth category and what obligations it puts on people that build these foundational models?
Well, providers of foundation models have to, and I'm going to read this out to get it right because it's long, demonstrate through appropriate design, testing, and analysis the identification, reduction, and mitigation of reasonable foreseeable risks to health, safety, fundamental rights, the environment, and democracy, and the rule of law. Prior and throughout development with appropriate methods, such as with the involvement of independent experts, as well as the documentation of remaining non-mitigable risks after development, which I think is interesting because it sort of breaks up this narrative. Well, we just provide the technology and then we don't really know what happens, which, for us Europeans is a little bit shocking coming from the US, that people provide this enormously interesting and powerful technology, and then the developers themselves say, well, we can't really control it, we don't really know what's going to happen. In every other industry sector, you would expect the provider of a product to have a vague kind of idea what that product could do in terms of harm. And I understand that for artificial intelligence this is quite difficult, but at least we require them to make an effort to figure this out. And I think another important obligation is the one on data governance. So it says they have to process and incorporate only data sets that are subject to appropriate data governance measures for foundation models, in particular measures to examine the suitability of the data sources and possible biases and appropriate mitigation, which is extremely important because one thing we really want to avoid in Europe from the beginning, we're very concerned about was bias, which we know most artificial intelligence entail. And it's very difficult to put the responsibility on companies using AI tools that are based on foundation models and then tell them, well, you need to get rid of the bias. I mean, how are they supposed to do that if it's in the foundation model? So I think it's very important that especially the providers of these big models really reflect on how to avoid bias seriously.
Yeah, and the other issue that I've seen raised is that of copyrighted materials being used in the training of these models. I imagine there's been quite a bit of discussion in the drawing up of this act uh, about the foundational models that are in the market now, GPT-4 or Google's Bard. Uh, how what do you do now? I mean, because those models are already trained and they're trained on uh, virtually the entire English language internet, or maybe the internet itself. I'm not sure how that was segregated.
They work
Uh,
pretty well in German as well, interestingly enough.
yeah. So I mean, you can't. Once the model is trained, you can't. Uh, take out that information. So does that mean that people providing foundational models will have to train from scratch, start over, and if they want to operate in Europe, provided that the act passes in its current form?
Well, to be very frank, I think it's a question that is currently very difficult to answer. But I think a good start would be oblige the providers of foundational models using that material to be open and frank about it and to be able to distinguish between copyrighted material and other kind of material. I mean, copyright may be a little bit outdated, but it's still a foundation, the economic basis for human creativity, basically. You know, journalism, arts, that all depends to some extent on copyright legislation. And we need to find a way forward there without just completely abolishing it. You know, I've been talking to artists who are very, very worried about what they're going to live on. And I think there's a component really of that goes beyond just the economic reward or the legislation in terms of what does this kind of technology mean for creativity? Because the AI looks very creative, but then its work is based on the work of humans, and if humans are not rewarded for it anymore in any way, at a certain point, creativity will end. So what does that mean? I'm not a copyright expert, so where this leaves us currently in terms of enforcement of copyright legislation, frankly, I don't know. The AI Act is not legislation yet. You explained that correctly. It's the Parliament's report, and now we enter negotiations with the Council, and then we will have a final legislation. And I think in the meantime, we will reflect on what that means for copyright legislation. I don't see OpenAI or Bard retraining completely their models, but maybe, looking into paying more attention to what kind of data is used to train these models. I think it's sort of a learning process for us as legislators to understand how artificial intelligence works and what it does to the world, but also to the developers and the companies providing it to abide, to comply with existing legislation, and to understand needs of society that are expressed by that legislation as well. So I see it
Yeah.
more as a process, frankly.
Yeah. The I mean, is there a concern in Europe that if the act is too restrictive, that Europe will fall behind in the implementation of AI and consequently fall behind economically?
There is a concern, definitely, more from the conservative side, I think, than from the more progressive part that I represent. But there is a concern. There is a concern that those products might not be rolled out in Europe, as Sam Altman said. Well, he would just leave. There is a concern of European companies not being able to build on these foundation models and therefore to fall behind. That is true, and I think we do need to take this seriously. On the other hand, the European Union is a huge market, and the digital world, it's basically a more Western world. So the Chinese market doesn't count that much because it's, in digital terms, it's a different universe. So Europe is still quite important, I think, for companies like Google and Meta and Microsoft to rolling out AI, and therefore I think there there will be some arm wrestling, but I think they will listen to us. And I know that many colleagues from the US as well are looking with great interest to what we are doing in Europe, and hope we might be a model. And at the same time, I think we do need artificial intelligence that serves humanity, that serves the people, and it's our task as elected legislators to make sure that that happens. I mean, corporations have a different purpose. Their purpose is to make money for their shareholders. So I think we need to tell them what society wants. And I try to listen to my voters and to the citizens, and figure out how they want artificial intelligence, and what should it be used for. And there's quite a lot of fear. And I think that doesn't help the companies either. People have the feeling they understand these instruments, they are in control. And if they want some more control, the providers of AI tools can provide it. And I think that would help us all. That would help the corporations, and it will help society.
Yeah. Uh, so right now, there's a dialogue or a trialogue, I guess they're calling it, in between the commission, the council, and the parliament to finalize this. What are the does the council tend to be more conservative and more pro AI, particularly with regard to the foundational models, than the parliament? I mean, are we likely to see this draft become more restrictive or less restrictive as it goes through this this negotiation?
Um, it depends. It's normally and currently council is a little more conservative than the parliament, and another government might change from progressive to conservative far right in the process. In Spain, that's a risk. But there is another, and conservatives or far right countries tend to be more open to what the corporations want. Definitely, this is the dynamics we have observed in Parliament as well. But there's also a second issue, or a second aspect, which is time, because the council came up with its position, which is called the general approach, earlier than Parliament. And something happened in the meantime before Parliament approved its position, and that was called ChatGPT. And that was the moment, like a week or two after ChatGPT was rolled out in Europe and everybody was using it, when the majority in the European Parliament completely changed. And the Conservatives went along with a few of the bans. For example, the one on recognition of sexual orientation or emotional recognition in education or in water management, that kind of thing, and went along with the idea to include the foundation models, which they didn't want to do before. And at that moment, I think they realized how crucial and how influential these models are, and that it is a good idea for a democracy to at least be able to understand what the risks are and where the data comes from. So there is this aspect of time and of really understanding what a foundation model is, and I think this might entail the fact that council might be a lot more open towards parliament's position as well. And the commission also had a very strong learning process. The general approach by council is very close to the original commission proposal. And that was also set out before ChatGPT. I think if the commission had to redo it, they would do it differently, and they would definitely include foundation models. Because in the beginning, the idea was just to cover high risk applications, and foundation models at the time were not considered high risk. Now, when you say, well, if OpenAI didn't do a lot of moderation, you could just ask a ChatGPT to explain how to build a bomb or something like that. They realize there is a high risk aspect to it, and I think council will realize that too. So, in terms of dynamics in council, let's see. And I think I'm very optimistic in terms of keeping the foundation models. I think the other big issue with council is that the biometric recognition in public spaces, because they're the ministers of the interior that would like to be able to surveil people to a much larger extent than members of parliament think that is useful. So I think that's
Yeah.
going to be one of the big issues. In terms of foundation models, I'm quite optimistic.
Yeah. On the foundational models, you say you're optimistic, or that there won't be major changes required on behalf of the providers of these models. I mean, that they won't have to, uh, that the existing models won't be banned based on the inability to identify copyrighted materials in their training data, for example, and that that companies providing those models will have to start from scratch. You're optimistic in that way, or you're optimistic that those restrictions will be waived for the current generation, and it'll be applied going forward.
I'm optimistic that the obligations to test and analyze, identify reasonably foreseeable risks and risk mitigation measures will stay in. And the obligations on data governance. That's what I'm optimistic about. What exactly that means for copyright, I can't say at the moment.
Yeah.
I think we will need a system to I don't know. Some people have been saying watermark or the copyrighted material or material created by artificial intelligence. I'm very frankly, I don't think we have the solution yet. But
Yeah.
I'm confident that the idea of providers of foundation models have obligations for these models and for the use of copyrighted material will stay in. What exactly this is going to look like, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah. How much have the big American AI companies been involved in this process? I mean, have you consulted with Meta and OpenAI and Google, uh, and how involved have they been in consulting on some of these issues?
Well, they're quite involved. They talk to the commission on a regular basis in different formats. They talk to the members of the European Parliament and were involved. They talk to the national governments. They are quite involved.
Yeah. Do you think that the negotiation of this act will have, until it's settled, will have a chilling effect on because right now we're in a period where everybody, across the economy is trying to figure out ways to integrate foundational models into their products and services. And in fact, there's a sort of coming wave of new startups and applications built from the ground up on these foundational models. But if you're an investor or a company in Europe, it seems to me you would be cautious about investing too much in building products and services based on foundational models as they exist today without knowing what the regulation is going to be in a year or two.
Well, I would see it the other way around. I think what we are basically doing is saying the providers of the foundational models themselves are responsible for fulfilling these obligations, because otherwise it would mean that the smaller companies implementing the foundation models in their products would be liable for fulfilling the whole legislation.
Hmm.
And the legislation already says if you are in a high risk environment, you have to make sure, for example, that the data is representative. How are you supposed to make sure that the data is representative if the provider of the foundation model just says, well, I have no idea where this data comes from? So I think what we're trying to do is to make sure that the burden of fulfilling the legislation is with the legal subject that can actually do that, has actually access to the data, and not with somebody just buying it or implementing it that doesn't really have the possibility to influence what happens. And usually what companies want is legal certainty and
Yeah.
not a completely open space. I mean, in the US, you have the same problem because if there's no legislation, companies are still liable in case of discrimination in lawsuits.
Yeah.
So we have a different system in Europe. We say, okay, we give you the legislation, but then if you fulfill the legislation, you don't have this enormously high risk in lawsuits, which have companies in the US. So it's a little bit different. But legal certainty is certainly something that companies in Europe do want, and making the people liable who actually develop the program, the tool, and have access to the data and have the possibility to know which data have been used. I think that makes sense. I don't think there's a chilling effect. I think there's more of a chilling effect if well, that probably there's something coming, but we don't know what it is. It's better to know what it is.
Yeah. And the are you consulting? I mean, imagine you are with the U.S. Congress, uh, because everyone's following this very closely, and the U.S. Congress is looking at legislation itself to set a legal framework around some of these things. How much influence do you think the parliament's having on what's happening in the U.S. Congress?
I'm I have the feeling I haven't been consulting personally directly. I have done that on the Digital Services Act, where I was really very directly involved. And what I heard then was, well, go ahead in Europe. We are super interested in what you're doing, and we try to follow your lead, but we have difficulties in the US putting together majority on these issues.
Yeah.
And it's actually more difficult to do if the companies are in your country and they are extremely powerful corporations. So in a certain sense, we have that advantage in Europe. I mean, we're sorry not to have the technology produced in on our continent, obviously, but it does give us some leeway to reflect on the legislation and to pass the legislation. What I'm hearing from my colleagues who have been to the US recently is that colleagues in the US are still looking very much at Europe and what we are doing, and that they appreciate the fact that it's a very dynamic kind of legislation. And then let's see
Yeah,
what
yeah.
happens.
When you say dynamic, you've used that word a few times.
Mm.
What do you mean that it can change over time?
Exactly. Yeah. That, for example, on the foundation models, what we are saying basically is not they are banned, they're not banned, or they have to do this and that. We are just saying providers take responsibility for what you're doing. So we asked, that's why I read out the paragraph on the risk assessments. They basically should themselves try to identify the risks and propose risk mitigations. So we're saying, well, you're rolling out this product, great, really interesting innovation, looking forward to using it, but please tell us what does it entail in terms of risk, which is exactly what you would tell pharmaceutical companies. So you're helping people get cancer therapy, great stuff. We're supporting you, but tell us what the side effects are. And if you don't do that, you get OxyContin or something like that. You know, this is we are just asking these companies to do what in each and every other industrial sector would be completely obvious.
Yeah,
You know, give us
yeah,
the product, very interesting, but tell us what the risks are. I mean, we do drive and we know it's dangerous, but we do have traffic lights as well. So what we are doing here is just, tell us what kind of traffic lights do we need? What do you think? And then let's discuss it. So
yeah.
I think this legislation, especially on the foundation models, will be evolving. But when you have an industry that's telling you, well, these are very interesting products, but we don't really know what they could do, I think we need to get involved as legislators. So, well, try to figure it out and let's discuss it together and figure out how we can protect our societies together and use these products in a way not to harm people.
Yeah. Uh, has the so-called threat debate that's cropped up in the last couple of months affected? I mean, I imagine it has the direction of the act. And have you had, because a lot of the people who are raising these concerns are originally European. Jan LeCun from France and Joshua Bengio from France and uh, Jeff Hinton from the UK. I'm not sure what their current nationalities are. They've lived in Canada for quite a while, but have those people been involved in talking to the Parliament? And the reason I ask is there's a discussion. That debate has split the community, the research community, but there is an effort right now uh, to come up with a consensus within the research community so that it's not just people sort of yelling at each other on Twitter, that there's some some unified view of what the risks are and how they can be addressed.
I don't think the fact that they are Europeans make a difference. I mean, a lot of the people developing and also financing this are Europeans. So the fact that those who point out the threat are of European origin, I don't think it made a difference. Absolutely. And
Right. Well, go ahead. I mean, but have you consulted with those senior researchers, people like LeCun and Bengio and Hinton in
I personally haven't. I don't know whether colleagues did. So
Yeah.
I haven't seen that as a formal process in the European Parliament, and I haven't personally, but I cannot exclude that other colleagues have done that. I don't know. I imagine they might have spoken to the Commission as well, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
yeah,
Go
what
ahead.
I do think is that more the discussion on the singularity issue and AI wiping out humanity has not been extremely powerful in Europe as far as this piece of legislation is concerned, because the first draft of this was written 2 years ago and is really trying to address the current very real risks, like bias, for example. Now, I think something I care a lot about is disinformation also, which is not that well addressed in the AI Act, actually. But I think bias was the big thing, security issues, that kind of thing. So more the things that are already on the table rather than what could happen in 10, 20, 50 years from now. That's more an intellectual kind of discussion also going on in Europe, but it hasn't had influence on this legislation, I think.
Yeah. And the where does how long is the process expected to take before this is formalized as law?
That is very difficult to foresee. Could be 6 months, could be 2 years. I
Right.
think there
Yeah.
is some ambition to conclude this within this mandate, which ends in June 2024. So we have a year basically. But that would mean that the negotiations would need to end by something like the end of the year, yeah, January, February, in order to be able to go back to Parliament and vote the final result, and Council the same. It's a complicated process, so need a couple of months in the end of the negotiations to put it through. I think that's the ambition everyone has, but it is a long piece of legislation with a lot of content and in an environment that is constantly changing at an amazing pace. So I can't promise that this is going to happen. I'm sure the Commission and Parliament would like this to happen.
Yeah. Uh, and on the enforcement, so the law gets passed. Who is charged with enforcement? And I understand that it's up to the uh, companies providing models to ensure that they adhere to the act, but who is reviewing models or will be reviewing models and deciding on which risk category they fall under and whether they're in breach of the act?
National authorities. So it's the governments of the member states who decide which authority will do what. Might be one single authority, it might be several. I'm hearing in the Netherlands it's going to be the Data Protection Authority, for example. In Germany, I think it's more what we call the agreed organism. So they authorities that do audits on technical specifications, like in the automotive sector, that kind of thing. It's I think there's going to be a variety of models of implementation, which is going to be very interesting. This is why we also have the board, where these authorities will exchange on a European level on their experiences.
Yeah. Uh, and what do you think would be the penalties? I mean, of course, it's too broad a question to answer very specifically, but what kind of penalties do you envision? I mean, is it the sort of thing as with uh, pollution, industrial pollution, that very large companies may be content to pay fines and continue to operate in the way that they do, or would they be banned entirely from the union? And in that case, how do you police that? How do you know if someone is using a foundational model that breaches the act?
That's a pretty good question. I think we start out. with fines. And I do have doubts about the efficacy of fines. We see that in data protection. That when Facebook, for example, was fined with a huge fine by the FTC, actually stocks went up the day after. So I do have my doubts about this. Yeah, it's also true that the data protection legislation has not been enforced very well in Europe. So we have a few fines, but more are coming. Then the Digital Services Act also works with fines. So this is going on full speed next year. And I think we will see some fines there. Maybe it's a mechanism that is, not at full speed yet. And at a certain point, it will become a mechanism which does become, not just cost of business, but a threat for a company, especially when you have shareholders watching this and saying, okay, these fines are accumulating, we are constantly violating important legislation, let's change. So this is what I hope for. um, I hope I'm not too optimistic.
And what about government uses of these of this technology? Does the act constrain governments and militaries of member countries?
Military issues are not covered explicitly. So military AI tools are not covered. It does constrain governments, yes. In many cases, the rules for governments are even stricter than for private operators, because clearly governments have full control over people, so people don't have a choice. In some cases, the European Parliament has made stricter rules also for private entities, where the European Commission only foresaw those strict rules for public entities. Cases like, for example, data scraping in the internet with image recognition, like Clearview, for example, the Commission only prohibited that for public actors, and we added a ban for private actors too, because I mean it's an absolute, especially for women, it's a super huge risk. People, see you in the street and can figure out where you live and what you have done in the past 20 years of your life. Almost every woman has had a stalker at some point in your life, and it's
Yeah.
it's just a total nightmare, the idea that there is a commercial software out there that allows everybody to know who you are just from looking at you or taking a picture or something like that. So but normally the rules for public entities, for governments, are even stricter than for private ones, yes.
Yeah. Um, and I mean, there's so many directions to take this. Um, there's a view that as this legislation takes hold and the technology continues to develop within those regulatory frameworks, that different zones, AI zones, will emerge. That you'll have the areas of Chinese influence where uh, AI uses in surveillance will be much uh, greater, and will have a much bigger impact on governing society. You'll have Europe where it's uh, it's less restrictive, but yet more restrictive than the U.S. And then you'll have the U.S., which will be kind of a bit of a wild west, depending on what Congress comes up with. Do you think that that's the case?
Might be, yes. It's a very probable scenario. There could also be a scenario of the US and Europe merging, and
Yeah.
the US maybe following at least the spirit of European standards. That depends on the US, I think.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it
As
depends
as
on,
has been the case with GDPR.
yes.
Yeah. Um, and going back to the foundational models, I mean, this is a real problem for regulators everywhere. But in that came along late in the process. Um, eh, what's your best guess of how that's going to evolve? That existing models like GPT-4, even though they cannot, with take out the data that the models were trained on. I mean, it's too late. The models are trained. Uh, that those will be grandfathered in, and these standards will be applied to models going forward, or that those original models will eventually uh, be banned because they were not designed with all of these questions in mind. I mean, it just and I know not no one can answer these definitively, but I'm just curious what you think.
Well, it would be great to have a glass view with us, wouldn't it? Um, yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, like some kind of grandfathering and going further. It depends a little bit on the choices the companies and the developers make. I think whether they say, well, the Europeans have a point there, and let's try to build models where we have more control over the data, which would make sense maybe in a US environment as well in order to avoid lawsuits because of discrimination, for example. I mean, it's pretty probable that when the foundation models gets implemented in some kind of other application, there will be a strong form of bias and discrimination because we know this is historical data, which is basically racist and sexist. And now they are sort of controlling it because you can't ask it to make jokes about men but not about women, but it requires an enormous moderation effort, and I think that is very interesting. That's something we don't have in the legislation because it sort of came up too late. But who is doing this moderation and based on what? So deciding what are the questions that ChatGPT can answer and which ones is it not allowed to answer. I think that's going forward the really interesting question. Can we get some transparency on that? Can we have a global standard? And what is that global standard? Is it human rights? I mean, this is where it really becomes interesting, where it becomes the cultural issue, a political issue, and where the US and Europe differ quite a lot. So I think that's the more interesting question. And they're saying the answer might be, well, we explain what the data is we've been using and what sort of the guardrails are in order also to have some kind of legal certainty not to be liable for every form of discrimination. I think that could be an idea. And how to get there, whether it is to start a wholly new model or whether it is rather modifying the data, because I mean the models get fed with new data and trained on new data as we speak, I suppose. And whether there's a gradual shift or a wholly new start, frankly, I'm not able to say. This
Yeah.
is something we would need to discuss. But I think even the developers and the companies can't say at this moment. They will wait for the legislation actually to enter into force probably before they change something and try to avoid it as long as it's not. And then we
Yeah.
see what the game look like. But I can envisage different kind of avenues there. But as I said, I mean, and this is developing so quickly that it's difficult to foresee from here.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you used ChatGPT or GPT-4 in your work or personal life?
I have experimenting more than really using it, and I used it to do different things, which was interesting because I had the feeling the hardest tasks it performed best, and the very easy ones it performed extremely poorly. Like I had it, just write about myself, who am I, and it came out like with the wrong birth date and the wrong commissions I serve on, like all the kind of information you can very easily see on the website. It was all wrong. And then I asked him to write very complicated, argumentations are for my for something I was negotiating, piece of legislation that is really complicated and very few people know about, and the arguments were great. It would have taken me 2 days to put that all down in Google, and in ChatGPT did it in 2 minutes, and it was amazingly good. It wasn't perfect, but it was amazingly good. So I'm a
Yeah.
little bit puzzled as to that.
Yeah, this is the hallucination problem, but there's a lot of the products coming out. There's a way to solve that. Um, I mean, already ChatGPT and Bing, there's a model that browses the internet, so it gives you
Yeah.
footnotes. But but the reasoning uh, power of the model is what people are seeing as a promise, not using it as as sort of a knowledge system, but as a reasoning system. And I'm curious.
People would see it as a knowledge system as well, that we use it instead of Wikipedia because it's so much quicker and it picks up knowledge. This is something that worries me because it's going to be the tool that gives access to the knowledge of the world, and who decides what kind of knowledge. I think this is something that I think is really interesting.
Yeah,
The experts are more interested in the reasoning and is this really intelligence and so on. But normal people just using it in their daily life, I think they're more interested in this, just abbreviating the task basically and having access to that, to all kinds of knowledge, and that it completely makes up the commissions I serve, the committees I serve on, is bizarre. But I think that will be fixed. What I found more worrying, and you probably know that example, that Tristan Harris came up with, that he shows how it's being implemented in Snapchat. And there's this example of a 13-year-old that basically tells the artificial intelligence implemented in Snapchat that it's going to be, he or she is going to date an adult, a 30 something year old, in a weekend away somewhere. And the tool just says, oh, well, that's great, and have fun, rather than saying, well, I should call the police. Um,
yeah,
so, and that's the kind of risk I think foundational providers of foundation models should foresee somehow before we go out and implement it everywhere. So that's the reason, just to come back to a question you asked me before. I mean, even if we lag behind a little bit in implementation in Europe, but if that means we make sure that people are safe, our kids are safe, for me, it's okay to lag behind a little bit.
yeah. So you're optimistic that these questions will be answered, and you think that within 2 years we'll have an act, uh, but it may not be implemented strictly at the beginning, because it's going to take time for providers of models to adjust. Uh, in sort of looking forward, do you do you see? I mean, the AI Act has gotten a lot of attention within the AI community, but this technology is really going to alter. Um it appears it's going to alter the every aspect of society, if not, and certainly of the economy. Uh, have I imagine that you guys have thought about what the world, or certainly what Europe, is going to look like in 5 or 10 years. Are you are you optimistic, hopeful, or are you Terrified.
I think the three at a time.
Yeah.
Depends on how I wake up in the morning. I'm optimistic because when I started politics, professional politics in 2019, and people told me, well, you can't regulate digital because it's such a new technology, and we know it's too late anyway, and you can't regulate it. It's all, don't even start. And then we did the Digital Services Act. We started at least enforcing GDPR in a little bit more serious well, still a long way to go. But the Digital Services Act was basically regulating social networks. And I had been told for a year, well, you can't do that. And yes, we can. Let's see what comes out of it next year, but it's possible. And now it's AI. And the thing started over. Well, you can't regulate it. You can't regulate it without stifling innovation, without having Europe lag behind. And now we are engaging in a process and we are regulating it. So I think that's the optimistic part. And then everybody tells you, when you look back into history, there were always times, industrialization, when it seemed that the world was just going completely rogue and terrible situations. And then in the end, something good came out of it. We dealt with it as humanity.
Yeah.
So that's the more optimistic part, saying, well, now we're not at war, we're not fighting, we are just debating, we are in a very civilized process of passing legislation, and let's see. I think the companies will, at a certain point, adapt to it. Maybe not, and the legislation is not perfect yet. There's not everything in there I would have wanted to see, and things are coming up, new things are coming up we are not dealing with yet. That's absolutely true. So that's the more optimistic part. The more terrifying part, if you look at the kind of surveillance this allows, the power concentrations in the hands of really a handful of companies out of Europe, what the Chinese totalitarian government is doing with it, the kind of environmental impact that it could have on top of the climate crisis we are already living and not really facing. Yeah, that there are moments when I am terrified, and I think it's justified to be both terrified and keep working. And in order to keep working, you need to have the belief that you can do it without being certain.
That's it for this episode. If you want to read a transcript of the conversation with Alexandra, you can find one on our website. That's eye-on.ai. And don't forget to check out TechCrunch's Found podcast if you're interested in how to build a startup. In the meantime, remember, I don't believe the singularity is near, but AI is about to change your world, so pay attention.